Up is down and down is up. That's exactly how I feel after watching a crazy week 2 fantasy football capped off by a fantastic Sunday night football game that was extremely physical. We got to start getting ahead of the curve and start preparing for week 3 fantasy football by going through some waiver ads that you need to make right away before week 3. So make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Now this first group of guys right here that I'm going through is guys that should already be on rosters, but they're low enough roster percentage on most platforms that you need to check availability on your league because these two guys shouldn't be on waivers right now. Rasheed Shaheed and Baker Mayfield should not be on waivers. Now, Rasheed Shaheed is 63.1% rostered. So again, the chances that he is on your waiver wire, probably pretty slim. He's only on waiver wires in 4 out of 10 leagues, basically. But with Rasheed Shaheed, this is a guy that I've never really been into that much. But this guy has maintained really good production for 2 weeks straight now. Now, I will say to people who are wanting to add Rasheed Shaheed, be prepared for him to not hit in certain weeks. He is a boomer bust type of guy. It just so happens that he's boomed in 2 weeks, but he does seem like a really good fit in this Clint Kubiak system where they have taken on 2 defenses now, one of them terrible, one of them pretty good, and made them both look JV level. So Rasheed Shaheed has been a good factor for both times in both these games. I think Rasheed Shaheed is going to continue to be a really big threat in this New Orleans offense. And then the other guy, Baker Mayfield, listen, with Baker Mayfield, he's about 60% rostered. His roster percentage right now is 60.6 on ESPN. So with Baker Mayfield here, this is the quarterback one. As of right now, this is the quarterback one after week 2, basically all the games being played. He has scored 29 fantasy points in week 1. Then he came back and he scored 19.8 fantasy points in this game. And he actually had several mistakes in this game versus the Detroit Lions in this week because he threw a pick. He also had a fumble. This guy made some mistakes, and he still was a really good fantasy quarterback this week. So Baker Mayfield, at this point, this guy should not be on waivers, especially if you are looking for a streaming quarterback or even just a really solid, reliable quarterback too. Baker Mayfield should not be on waiver wires right now. Now, this next group here is the guys that you need to just claim right now, and these are the guys that are under 50% rostered, so they're likely available on your waiver wire. Quinton Johnson, Kahlil Shakir, Jaylen Tolbert, Alec Pierce, Josh Reynolds, Zack Herz, Hunter Henry, Mike Gesicki, Derek Carr, Tyler Johnson, and Demarcus Robinson. So this is obviously your group of wide receivers, tight ends, and quarterbacks here. Starting out with Quinton Johnson. Quinton is the big guy that you need to take immediately off your waiver wire. Now, I actually said last week, if you remember on the waiver video, you need to keep an eye on Quinton Johnson because this guy is being used correctly in this Los Angeles Chargers offense now. If you look back to what he did at TCU, this guy was a good crossing route type of guy. Quinton Johnson was used like that in week 1, and he broke out. Finally had a massive game in week 2 fantasy football. Quinton Johnson comes out, 5 catches on 6 targets and 2 touchdowns for 51 yards. 19.6 fantasy points in a half PPR format. So Quinton Johnson, as far as I'm concerned, looks like at the very least a wide receiver 2. It's not Josh Palmer. The only real competition he has at this point is Ladd McConkey. And Ladd had a bad game himself. So I'm not saying that you need to go out and right away start him, but 6.9% rostered with a quarterback like Justin Herbert attached to him, you absolutely need to take Quinton Johnson before he is scooped up right out from under your nose. Kahlil Shakir should not be on waivers either, but somehow he's still under 50% rostered after last week, and I don't get it. 49.1% rostered on ESPN. And listen, Kahlil Shakir hasn't had like any kind of big explosion game. Maybe that's the reason why he's still under 50% rostered. He had 11.7 points in week 1 in half PPR and 8.1 points in week 2 versus the Miami Dolphins on Thursday night. But both times he has looked like the most reliable target, catching every single target from Josh Allen. So as of today, he is the wide receiver 1 in this offense. Now, I believe it will be Keon Coleman at some point, the more and more integrated they get him in. But as of right now, Kahlil Shakir has legitimate value, and he should not be sitting on your waiver wire because this is a guy who will have a big game one time this year, and it will definitely be a guy that has trade value moving forward. So Kahlil Shakir should not be on waivers. Jaylen Tolbert, 4% rostered. Never been a big Jaylen Tolbert guy, but over the offseason, we heard that he was going to be more involved. We saw it come to fruition. in week 2. 6 catches on 9 targets for 82 yards. Now, the one caveat I have with this one in particular is that the Cowboys were getting crushed by the time Jaylen Tolbert basically had any kind of fantasy upside, and how likely is it going to be sustainable? This one is not as certain as Kahlil Shakir and Quinton Johnson. I'm very confident telling you guys you need to pick them up as your priority number 1 and 2 at the wide receiver position. This is more of a fallback option if you want to take another shot on the guy in a high upside offense with Dak Prescott at quarterback. They're coming off a bad week, so I wouldn't look too deeply into this, but I do think Jaylen Tolbert has legitimate upside in fantasy moving forward. Alec Pierce, the next wide receiver. You know, with Alec Pierce, again, I'm eating crow a little bit on this one because I've never been a big Alec Pierce guy. And honestly, I'm still not that great on him. He had 7 targets this week and he had 3 last week. That's 10 targets in 2 games, 5 targets a game basically. And it's like he had 2 touchdowns in the past 2 weeks. So he had 1 this week and 1 last week. 20 fantasy points in week 1, 14 in week 2. And it's like, this guy is really dependent on big plays and touchdowns. Now, I will say he was more balanced in week 2. And that's kind of the reason I'm here right now, saying that I think Alec Pierce is actually a pretty decent pickup right now. Because if you look at what's working in this Indianapolis offense, and they've got a lot of problems, by the way, that I'm sure I'll discuss throughout the week. So stay tuned, make sure you're subscribed to catch every video. But Alec Pierce is kind of what's working. Michael Pittman's not working right now. So Alec Pierce just seems to have some built-in chemistry there with Anthony Richardson. Don't know why that is, but it seems to be working. And this is why Alec Pierce is probably a good waiver wire pickup at this point. Josh Reynolds in Denver, not a ton of upside, but definitely seems to be the wide receiver 1, according to Bo Nix at the very least. 5 targets in week 2 against the Steelers and 8 targets in week 1. So this guy very well looks like he is the wide receiver 1 by all accounts the past 2 weeks. I mean, this guy is on tons of waiver wires at the moment. So I think that Josh Reynolds is a guy that if you're really desperate in like an 18-team league or like a 16 or 14-team league, Josh Reynolds needs to be picked up. Zack Herz, if you're having issues with tight end, him, Hunter Henry, or Mike Gesicki, those are guys that you definitely can pick up. So with Zack Herz here, I think that Zack Herz, I hate to be the downer, right? Like, I know a lot of us are kind of ready to see movement and like, oh, let's move on with Zack Erz's career because he's been in the NFL for so long and he's kind of been mediocre the last several years. The reality is this guy is involved. He was last week. He was again this week. 4 targets in both weeks. Caught all of them in week 2. He missed one of them in week 1. So as desperate as a lot of us are at the tight end position, this is a guy who's providing legitimate, consistent upside in his Washington Commanders offense. It's not Terry McLaurin who's number 1. Zack Ertz has been the most effective both weeks in fantasy for the Washington Commanders. 4.3 points in week 1 and 8.2 points in week 2. So Zack Ertz, to me, I don't love the player, obviously, but there's a reality here that we need to address with Zack Ertz, and that's the fact that he is definitely involved on a weekly basis in this Washington Commanders offense. So as far as I'm concerned, Zack Ertz is pretty much a must-add if you're struggling at tight end, which, by the way, lots of us are. So I think Hunter Henry is a little bit more risky because his week 1 involvement was not particularly great. 3 targets and he had 12 targets in week 2 against the Seattle Seahawks. I mean, this guy literally had a massive game. And I remember him doing it last year at the beginning of the year. So it's not a guy I'm exactly confident on saying that he has tons of fantasy upside moving forward. But who wouldn't take 14.9 fantasy points at the tight end position right now? I got a secret for you. Everybody would take that. So I think that Hunter Henry is another worthy tight end add. And then Mike Gesicki. The Bengals historically have not used tight ends with Joe Burrow, but he's been involved the last 2 weeks. 4 targets in week 1 and 9 targets in week 2. This guy has been involved. So it's probably, in my opinion, a result of T. Higgins not being there. I think that's a big part of what this is with Mike Gesicki right now. So it's not anybody I'm really confident in moving forward. But again, at the tight end position, you need to just take swings most of the time. I mean, unless you have like a top 5 or 6 tight end, you need to be taking swings because a guy like Mike Gesicki just went for 12.6 fantasy points in a half PPR league. So if he can sustain this level of involvement in the offense, I think that Mike Gesicki is obviously a really worthy waiver ad right now. And if Baker Mayfield's not on your waiver wire and you need a quarterback, Derek Carr. Derek Carr, you know what? Is the quarterback too right now in fantasy football. Derek Carr is so widely available as well. This dude is only 9.5% rostered on ESPN. I mean, his availability is so wide because like some others, I will take the brunt of this one though. Did not believe in Derek Carr to start the year. I thought he was over. I thought it was done and unsalvageable. Clint Kubiak has salvaged Derek Carr. It's official. I mean, I don't know how he sustains this level of efficiency, to be honest with you. I mean, he threw 3 touchdowns in week 1 on 23 throws, and he threw 2 touchdowns on 16 attempts in week 2 versus the Cowboys defense of all defenses. So 21 points in fantasy week 1, 22.8 in week 2. That doesn't lie. So I think Derek Carr is definitely going to be a one to watch for sure. I mean, Derek Carr, if you're having quarterback issues, you got to pick this guy up because he's playing really well right now. And Clint Kubiak and him seem to have a really good trust in each other already through week 2. Now, these two guys, I think, are pretty much out of necessity. Tyler Johnson and Demarcus Robinson. They're both Los Angeles Rams wide receivers. And of course, if you did not hear the news, Cooper Kupp went down with an injury in this matchup. So Cooper Kupp, I don't know what the news is. Obviously, I'm filming this on Sunday night, so I don't know what the timetable is. I read that he was walking around with a boot, so that doesn't sound particularly great about his availability for week 3. That's why one of these two guys needs to be on your roster. Tyler Johnson is my preferred guy out of this group because even though he had 3 targets in week 2, Demarcus Robinson only had 4. And Tyler Johnson had 7 last week. So I just think that this was kind of a weird game for the Rams that you can't really take much from. Because I just don't think, like, they were never in this game. It was a blowout from the beginning. They were out of sorts from the very beginning. So I think the Rams, you just kind of got to take it as a wash in this week. So I prefer Tyler Johnson still personally. Demarcus Robinson obviously is the veteran guy. He's leading between the two of these guys in targets at this point. But the reality is, either way you go, you need to have one of these guys on your roster. Because we already know Puka's out for an extended period of time. It looks like Cooper Kupp possibly might be heading that same direction. So the Rams are desperate at wide receiver. You need to grab one of these two guys off your waiver wire today. And the good news is Tyler Johnson, he's 12.9% rostered, and Demarcus Robinson is 33.7% rostered. Now, dropping down to our running backs here that you need to claim. Tai Chandler, Antonio Gibson, Rico Gathers, Briar Allen, and Bucky Irving here. Now, with Tai Chandler, 46.7% rostered. And I actually told quite a few people to drop Tai Chandler this past week. So, sorry for those who did, because I think Tai Chandler needs to be on rosters again. Look, Tai Chandler is going to be streaky because obviously, one of the offseason reports that we saw quite a bit was he was going to be the 1B to the 1A, which was Aaron Jones. So it's like you never really could feel comfortable watching Tai Chandler in week 1 because he didn't have great efficiency. Everything changed in week 2 versus the 49ers of all teams. One of the biggest shocks of the week. He comes out and he has 8.2 yards per carry on 10 carries. 82 yards. I don't think he's going to do that every week. But I do think that based on the involvement we've seen in the past 2 weeks, at the very least, good handcuff for Aaron Jones, and if not, sometimes flexible. Now, Carson Steel was one of those later ads for me because obviously Isaiah Pacheco went down with an injury. I don't know the status of him either. Now, Carson Steel did not do anything impressive when he came in. He had 7 carries, 24 yards, 3.4 yards per carry, and he had a fumble. That adds up to 0.4 fantasy points in a half PPR format. So obviously this is not anything that you could be really excited about, other than the fact that if Isaiah Pacheco misses time, Carson Steel looks like he was the clear choice as the RB backup for Isaiah Pacheco. We know that Samaje Perine will get involved in targets, and you could kind of throw him in here too if you want to add Samaje Perine, but Carson Steel looks like the lead carry guy. Now, Antonio Gibson, man, never thought I'd see the day, but he's 32.4% rostered, and Antonio Gibson has been involved both of the past 2 weeks. Now, week 1, he was inefficient. Very similar story to Tai Chandler. 7 carries, 18 yards. This week, though, gets 96 yards on 11 carries versus the Seahawks defense. So Antonio Gibson, again, very good handcuff back. to Ramondre Stevenson if he's available, and possible flex guy in the next coming weeks. And then with Rico Dowdle here, Rico Dowdle is someone that I never advised anybody to drop. Rico Dowdle should not be on waivers at this point. But unfortunately, especially after last week, he ended up on waivers. Rico Dowdle is 37.4% rostered, and he ended up leading the team in carries this week. Now again, the Cowboys weren't really in this game, so you can't take too much from this, but this is a guy who was involved last week and he was involved this week, and he actually ended up having 5 targets in this game. So he had a total of 12 opportunities in this game versus the New Orleans Saints. So I think that Rico Dowdle is just in a position where it's a toss-up who's going to be this running back one, and in this Dallas Cowboys offense, you want access to that. So Rico Dowdle should not be on waivers. Braylon Allen, man, he comes out, has a massive week, 18.6 fantasy points in a half PPR format, and I gotta tell you, Braylon Allen looks really good on his work. Now, Breece Hall was kind of in and out of that game because apparently he was injured. I haven't seen anything that would worry me for his status in week 3. But again, handcuff guy, one of the best in the league at this point, one of the best in fantasy football, because this dude looked really good on almost every single touch. 4.7 yards per carry and averaged 11.5 yards per reception. Braylon Allen at this point needs to be on your roster, especially if you have Breece Hall. And even if you don't, this guy is going to be able, you're going to be able to dangle this guy in front of the Breece Hall owner, and is going to have a lot of value on the trade market in the next several weeks. And then Bucky Irving, 29.6% rostered. I said it last week, you need to keep your eye on this guy, and I'm ready to add him now. The problem is not, the thing is not that he was good. Like, he averaged 3.1 yards per carry. Rachaad White was even worse. Rachaad White averaged like 2 yards per carry in this game. And obviously he came out like with an injury, came back in. So it's like maybe Rachaad White was just dealing with an injury and that's why he was bad. But Bucky Irving to me looks like a guy who might end up taking more work as the season goes on in this backfield. So at this point, I view him as a little bit more than a handcuff. I think this guy with legitimate upside to become possibly a 1B to the 1A of Rachaad White. So Bucky Irving should not be on waivers anymore. And my last guy that you need to keep your eye on, just wait a week, keep your eye on this guy, Jalen Nailor of the Minnesota Vikings. 0.5% rostered. Nobody's really looking at him. They might be looking at him soon, though. Justin Jefferson did not return. He left that game early because of a quad injury. Now, he said he's going to be fine, but he didn't come back, which indicates to me, in a close matchup, there's probably something more going on here. Jalen Nailor ended up being pretty involved. He had three catches on 4 targets and a touchdown for 54 yards. I'm not saying that that's fantastic that you can rely on, but if Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison miss time, Jalen Nailor is legit pickup. So let me know how your team did in week 2 fantasy football.